In June of 2020, one of Germany's most valuable tech companies admitted that 1.9 billion euros on its balance sheet simply didn't exist. The money was never there. 1.9 billion euros just gone. Poof. Like it was never real. Because it wasn't. The CEO arrested within days. The COO, he vanished, literally disappeared into thin air. 24 billion euros in shareholder value destroyed, and 6,000 people woke up without jobs. And that missing executive? He's now a fugitive living in Moscow running spy networks for Russia. This is the story of Wirecard, the biggest fraud in German history. Now, before we get to the collapse, you need to understand what Wirecard actually was, and more importantly, what everyone believed it was. Wirecard was founded in 1999, right at the tail end of the dot-com boom. The company started out processing online payments for pornography and gambling websites, the kind of transactions that Visa and MasterCard wanted nothing to do with. In those early days, Wirecard intentionally miscoded illegal gambling transactions to slip past the card networks. Not exactly the origin story you'd put in a press release. Enter Markus Braun, Austrian PhD in commercial computer science, turtleneck-wearing technocrat, the European Steve Jobs. Braun became CEO in 2002, and over the next 16 years, he transformed Wirecard from a scrappy, morally dubious payment processor into what appeared to be one of Europe's great tech success stories. Wirecard listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange in 2005, and in 2006 it acquired a bank, XCom Bank AG, and it suddenly wasn't a tech company anymore. It had a banking license. It was legitimate. By 2007, it was expanding into Asia, and the growth numbers were staggering. And then came the moment that turned Wirecard into a national treasure. In September of 2018, Wirecard was admitted to the DAX 30, Germany's index of its 30 most valuable public companies. Wirecard was now valued at approximately 24 billion euros. Analysts called it the European PayPal. Politicians posed for photos with Braun, and Angela Merkel personally lobbied for the company on a trade trip to China. Germany had finally found its tech champion, a world-class fintech to rival Silicon Valley. There was just one small problem. Most of it was a lie. Here's the thing about massive frauds. They don't collapse because the criminals slip up. They collapse because someone, usually someone nobody listens to at first, starts asking the right questions. The first cracks appeared long before anyone was paying attention. In 2008, a German shareholder association flagged irregularities in Wirecard's balance sheet, but nobody cared. The stock was going up. But then in 2016, a short-selling research firm called Zatara published a devastating report alleging outright fraud at Wirecard. Wirecard's response? Did they open their books? Did they invite independent auditors in? No, they went on the attack. They threatened lawsuits. They called the short sellers criminals. But the real story begins with a man named Dan McCrum. McCrum was an investigative reporter at the Financial Times, first tipped off around 2014 to something strange at Wirecard. Wirecard's Asian operations, which supposedly generated half of the company's revenue and nearly all of its profits, were much smaller than claimed. Businesses that should have been bustling operations were tiny offices with a couple of people in them. Revenue figures that looked incredible on paper looked impossible in person. In 2018, McCrum got his biggest break. An internal whistleblower came forward with evidence of accounting fraud in Wirecard's Singapore operations. Forged contracts, backdated documents, an executive named Ido Kurniawan systematically fabricating numbers. In January of 2019, the Financial Times published its exposé. Now, surely, once the Financial Times, one of the most respected newspapers on the planet, publishes evidence of fraud, the authorities step in, right? BaFin, Germany's top financial regulator, the equivalent of the SEC, looked at the situation and decided to investigate the Financial Times, not Wirecard, the journalists. BaFin actually banned short selling of Wirecard stock, making it illegal to bet against the company. Let me say that again. Germany's financial regulator made it a criminal act to bet that a fraudulent company's stock would fall. Dan McCrum was threatened with jail, not by Wirecard, but by the German government. And it gets worse. Wirecard didn't just rely on friendly regulators, they went full offensive. Anonymous blogs appeared accusing McCrum of financial misconduct, and private investigators were deployed to monitor the Financial Times offices in London. And the short sellers who dared to question Wirecard, they received visits from what McCrum described as gangster types, sent to intimidate and threaten them. By early 2020, you had a journalist with evidence of fraud, a regulator protecting the company, and an entire apparatus of intimidation designed to make anyone who questioned Wirecard pay a personal price for doing so. The truth didn't stand a chance. Or so Wirecard thought. To understand how the whole thing fell apart, you first need to understand how the fraud actually worked. When you tap your credit card at a coffee shop, there's a chain of companies between you and that coffee. Your bank, the card network, and crucially, something called a payment acquirer. The payment acquirer is the company that actually processes the transaction for the merchant. That's what Wirecard did. They were the middleman. And in markets where Wirecard didn't have a license to operate directly, places like the Philippines, Singapore, and Dubai, they claimed to use what they called third-party acquirers, or TPAs. Think of it like a franchise. Wirecard would say, we don't process the payments ourselves in these countries, but we have local partners who do it on our behalf, and they send us the profits. And according to Wirecard, those TPAs were generating roughly half of their worldwide revenue and nearly all of their profit. Imagine if Apple told regulators that half of its revenue came from 3 unnamed shops in Manila. They'd have a lot of questions. And the transactions those TPAs were supposedly processing, they were largely fictional. The revenue was fake, the profits were fake, and the money that should have been accumulating from all this phantom business, Wirecard claimed it was sitting in trustee accounts at 2 Philippine banks, BDO and BPI. 1.9 billion euros supposedly just sitting there safe and sound. To make the scam work, they used a technique called round tripping. Money was moved in circles between Wirecard's subsidiaries and external businesses to create the appearance of legitimate revenue flowing in. And when Wirecard needed to explain where all this profit was being invested, they conveniently acquired companies across Asia, most of which didn't actually exist except for on paper. It was fraud, layered on fraud, layered on fraud. Which brings us to the auditors. EY, formerly Ernst & Young, one of the Big Four accounting firms. They were supposed to be the adults in the room. They were supposed to verify that Wirecard's numbers were real, but they didn't. For years, EY accepted verbal assurances instead of independent bank confirmations. They missed at least 11 fraud risk indicators over the course of the engagement and never once contacted the Philippine banks. They were even warned in 2016 that something might be wrong, and they signed off anyway. It wasn't until 2020, when EY finally picked up the phone and called the banks in the Philippines, that they got the answer everyone should have gotten years earlier. The accounts didn't exist. They had never existed. And then, in June of that year, EY refuses to sign off on Wirecard's 2019 financial statements. They can't verify 1.9 billion euros supposedly held in the Philippines. Wirecard stock dropped 60% in a single day, and CEO Marcus Braun resigns. Then, on June 22nd, Wirecard issues a statement that will live in corporate infamy forever. The 1.9 billion euros, they say, probably never existed. COO Jan Marsalek is removed from his position and tells former colleagues that he's flying to the Philippines to prove the money is real. He does not fly to the Philippines. On June 23rd, Marcus Braun is arrested on charges of market manipulation and accounting fraud, and on June 25th, Wirecard files for insolvency. 1 week, that's all it took, from one of Europe's most valuable tech companies to bankrupt and under criminal investigation in 7 days. At its peak in 2018, Wirecard was valued at approximately 24 billion euros, and by the end, investors had lost 99.84% of that. And COO Jan Marsalek, who said he was flying to the Philippines to prove the money was real, turns out he was a Russian spy and was actually flying to Belarus on his way to Moscow, where he now lives under a false identity. And he hasn't been sitting idle either. In 2025, 6 Bulgarian nationals were convicted in the United Kingdom of espionage for running a spy ring that Marsalek had been directing from Moscow. He's also been linked to payments connected to the Wagner Group and to espionage operations targeting Russian opposition figures across Europe. As for Marcus Braun, the CEO, he's been detained for over 5 years. His trial began in December of 2022 and has been ongoing ever since, with a verdict expected sometime later this year. He blames everything on Marsalek. In September of 2024, a Munich court ordered former board members to pay 140 million euros in damages, and in January of 2026, 2 key operatives in Singapore received jail time for their role in falsifying Wirecard's accounts. As for the auditors, EY's reputation has been shattered, and the firm has been banned from auditing public interest companies in Germany moving forward. BaFin's head resigned in disgrace, and 6,000 Wirecard employees who had nothing to do with the fraud lost their jobs overnight. So what's the lesson here? It's not watch out for fraud, right? Duh. The real lesson of Wirecard is that when powerful people tell you that the person asking questions about them is the villain, that's usually when you should start paying the most attention to the questions. Dan McCrum asked questions. Short sellers asked questions. Shareholder activists asked questions. And every single one of them was punished for it. By the company, by the regulator, by the market. Wirecard is a story about what happens when those in power decide it's easier to believe a lie than face the truth. The lie was comfortable. The lie made money. And the truth was inconvenient, so they attacked it until they couldn't. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.